Moving from one career to the next can be intimidating, exciting, and terrifying all at the same time. A lot of professionals have changed career paths due to layoffs, retirement, or just the need to try something different. Our discussion today highlights the impressive career of our guest, who found that the key to his success was effective communication, the development of relationships, and continued learning. Stay tuned to listen how communication played a role in his experience as an investigator, a business expert, appearing in the media, and even testifying in front of Congress. This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Dave Johnston is Vice President of Asset Protection and Retail Operations for the National Retail Federation. In his role, he leads initiatives and member programs focused on asset protection and store operations, facilitating engagement across the industry and promoting best practices and policy initiatives around crime, violence, loss, and the issues challenging the profitability of retail store operations. With almost 4 decades of loss prevention and corporate security expertise, Johnston's experience includes senior roles as a practitioner, a consultant, and a solution provider. Prior to joining the NRF in 2022, he led the global security and loss prevention function of one of the world's largest multi-branded restaurant organizations. Johnston's a double graduate of the University of Massachusetts Lowell with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and a master's degree in security studies. We're going to talk about how communication has impacted Dave Johnston's career, his professional and personal growth, and how it's impacted his ability to appear in front of a camera or even testify in front of Congress today. Stay tuned to the end of our episode as we mention the NRF Protect conference and provide you an exclusive $200 off discount code for retailers that might be listening. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I'm your host, Dave Thompson, not to be confused with my guest, David Johnston, today. To help differentiate us, I'm the fan of the Buffalo Bills winning team here in the last few years, and Mr. Dave Johnston is a long-term, lifelong New England Patriots fan. Is that still correct? You still own that today?
That is still correct, and I think we do have a few more titles than Buffalo. Even though they do win, they do lose the most important game.
We are going to skip that part of the discussion today. I'm really happy that David's able to join us. Currently the Vice President of Asset Protection and Retail Operations at the National Retail Federation, or NRF, which we'll talk a little bit about. And I want to get into that in a second. And what's really neat, I think, for our guest today, and you heard a little bit about David's background already, but you've been in so many different really neat roles in your career and different perspectives and different job tasks. And now you're working with media and legislators and retail members. But as you and I have talked over the years, really, it seems like the core fundamental to your success has been your ability to just communicate, right, amongst all the career fields. I want to kick off with a question about your first job ever in this space. And so there's probably some things that you don't want to share about how maybe the loss prevention industry was run back then, but what was your first kind of entry into the retail or loss prevention space?
Well, my first entry was probably like most, right? So, was expecting to get into law enforcement, was going to school, criminal justice, and took a role as a store detective in a department store. And, just to set the time perspective, because you're right, I'm embarking on almost 40 years, or at 40 years of my career. At that time, you were the security department, and it was all about reactive, catch the shoplifters, catch the thieves, handcuffs, law enforcement, police, and so forth. So we've seen a lot of change over those decades of experience. A lot of it good, a lot of it a great evolution. But as you had mentioned, there are things that you take along the way that are very core to your learnings and your growth, and communication is definitely one of them.
Yeah, and I think so for our listeners, we've got people in all different aspects of life and different professional kind of roles, everything from law enforcement, human resources, maybe loss prevention, maybe sales, or just business professionals. And so what I'm looking forward to that we're going to discuss is how your role has really evolved over the last several years. But communication has been woven into each one of these kind of job tasks that you've had. But if you were to look back to some of these first jobs where maybe or maybe not you were chasing shoplifters down and doing things that we would highly recommend against in today's world, Is there anything from a communication standpoint that maybe you wish you would have known then that you know now?
Well, in the very early stages when you're out there catching shoplifters, and yes, we did chase shoplifters down the streets of Boston, and just a very interesting fact is we were special police officers where I worked in the city of Boston, and there was a clause of safe and continuous pursuit, and not to put anything there, I'm sure the statute of limitations have expired, but safe and continuous pursuit could mean you're on the train heading out of Boston. As long as you can see them in the next car, you can apprehend them 3 cities away. So, it was definitely a changed environment, or an interesting environment back then. But, it really wasn't until, and I'm not saying this because of the conversation with you and Wicklander Zalowski, but it wasn't until I actually started to get training in interviewing, and then as my career continued along, focusing, I see three things. I'll step back and I see three things in my career that have been extremely helpful to me. Number one, and we're going to talk about it today, is communication. Even before communication, is being a constant learner and continual learner. And not only learning about your profession, but learning about your industry and learning about other related industries that have a play in that, and we'll hear through the conversation of how I've had to pivot several times and learn new things in order to be a better business person, a better communicator. And then the third thing is building solid relationships, and you really can't do any of those without that core piece of communication. So getting the WZ training, and I was trained in the read technique as well. So the difference in the two really helped to shape it. I definitely use more of the WZ than I do the prior. But I think that being able to continuously hone your skills in communication, to become a better communicator, to learn from others who are better communicators, is something I would have liked to have done even earlier in my career.
Do you feel like, as you talk about, those three pillars, which I think are neat to expand on, has there ever been a time where maybe you felt um, either underqualified or not maybe had the experience for a certain role, but your ability to communicate set you up above your peers, or kind of put you in a position at least to become more educated or qualified?
Well, absolutely, and I think one position right away that was when I took the role at Dunkin Brands to lead that department. Dunkin Brands at the time was a franchised restaurant environment, so it was very unique to me, where I had not done food retail in my past. I had definitely not worked with a franchise environment, so none of the 22,000 stores were corporate owned. And then they were global, 65 countries. So I walked into a position where, I was being asked to take a look at and kind of evolve the LP department to more of a very consultative, proactive approach with its franchisees. And, truth be told, this is the podcast, a couple of things. First of all, from a leadership perspective, it was the first time I actually was leading a team more than a handful of people. So it was the largest team I was leading. And again, it was very unique and different environment for me. But what got me that role was not so much my skills in loss prevention and asset protection, because there were many other people as qualified, if not more qualified. It was my way of communicating to different layers and levels, not only within the organization, but the franchise organization as a business person, more so than a loss prevention, executive. In the franchise environment, particularly a brand like Dunkin, you had millionaires who were franchisees, and you had to try to communicate to them the value of loss prevention. You had to persuade them in understanding the value of the concepts of loss prevention. And then you couldn't tell them what needed to be done. You had to kind of, again, consult with them and show them, this is what you're going to get. And, as a millionaire, sometimes they were like, well, is it going to save me $10,000, $100,000 or more?
Right.
And depending on what it was, but, for a safe and secure environment, sometimes those dollars aren't easily quantifiable, at least directly. It's indirect. So that was one area where I think going in, I may have felt slightly unqualified from the readiness to handle a global position, with such a different, unique organization, but I knew I was very qualified to be able to learn, build relationships, and engage. And that's where I saw that I was very successful in
Yeah, I
that
think
role.
that's great. Those three pillars are really good, just good career advice, right? Regardless of what position somebody might be in that's listening, is if you connect with the right people, you're open-minded enough to continue to learn, and you can communicate effectively, you can really grow into any role. And I want to learn more about Duncan, and I know we'll get to this because you had some interesting pivot points in your career before you got to that point. But since we're on the topic, for people that are unfamiliar, and you don't have to be specific to Dunkin' brand, but what is the role of loss prevention or security or fraud prevention when we're thinking about, like restaurant service or hospitality? Because it's more about than just stealing donuts. And I do remember there was free donuts at the I think they were free. Otherwise, I was responsible for some of the loss. But I remember free donuts at the corporate office. But what is it? What is actual the role? What are some of the things that people do in an environment like that that might take advantage of an organization?
Well, when you look at I'll talk more about a franchise environment. I think that but to start off with a restaurant environment versus a retail environment, um, depending on what you're selling and how your restaurant's set up and stored. But a QSR like a Dunkin', we didn't have a lot of external theft. So, even the organized retail crime that's taking place now across the industry, that's not something that you would see, at least on the product side. But when it came to internal theft, of course, the restaurants experience a lot of internal theft, whether it be cash or product. Again, in the specific environment to Dunkin' Brands, the mobile app was something that was coming out and was very successful. So we did experience digital fraud, online fraud. So we had a team that was developed and worked on that. But one of the unique differences is, having to look and monitor franchisees against things like underreporting sales or not using authorized product or ingredients. And even some instances where, there are some instances where franchisees may have unauthorized locations, where they may, decide to take some of the older merchandise or older equipment and build up a location, or a third party decides to create an unauthorized location and you use the brand. So you have brand protection, you have royalty assurance, and then of course, the other piece of that is consulting with the franchisees to help them understand the value of a loss prevention program, and then teaching them and educating them on the concepts so that they can go and build it out on their own.
I think that's fascinating. So you could, because especially in a global brand, right? And doesn't just have to be Dunkin', anybody that's global, that you could have franchisees or anybody else just creating almost counterfeit or fake locations that are not necessarily recognized by the corporate brand or not even aware that that exists, right? And so how do you come across even finding something like that? Is it customer complaints? Is it people on the ground looking for potential brand integrity issues?
Yeah, it's all across the board. It doesn't have to be international. It could even be domestic, where you may have locations that look like a Dunkin' or are branded, like the brand. It doesn't have, of course, doesn't have to be a Dunkin'. Are they selling product there? Are they making more product? And then shipping additional product to these locations. Are they even kind of working with an outside party and having them sell the merchandise or sell the product? So it may not be branded as that franchise brand, but the product could be sold as that brand at a third party location, and you see that sometimes in things like, train stations, smaller airports, um, the outskirts of some international, location, because with the franchise and the license environment, and it really depends on the franchisor themselves, because the brands I worked with may have different types of agreements than other franchise brands. Do you own your supply chain, or are the licensees responsible for going and getting their own products? Do you control the real estate, or do you ask the franchisees to go out and secure their own real estate? So it's a very interesting world the franchise world, and it's even more it's more interesting when you get into the different complexities of food over product.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so, like tying communication back into this, I'm just imagining, in your role and in the team that you had, it's probably a lot of cross-cultural communication if you have a global presence. How did that impact? Did you have any miscommunication issues or maybe mixed signals when you're trying to interact kind of cross-culturally?
Well, absolutely. You have to make sure that you understand, the culture, and you understand the, how those cultures do communicate. And that, and again, that's not only internationally, but it's also domestically, right? Some of the franchises out there, may be owned and operated by folks who have immigrated over to the United States. And so this may not be their first language, or this may not be their first, of course, their home country. And then making sure that they understand the language that we're using from a loss prevention perspective, and we understand their culture and their language, and what may be different. You go into some countries where, it might be okay to give product to somebody for free because you're extending them, a courtesy because of a role or a position that they may have in the in the government or in the locale, and you have to be aware of that. Or what are the products that are different over there than they are over here. So it was interesting in communication and understanding, and that's where again it gets back to you learn it, you build relationships, because one person can't understand and know everything from a global perspective. So you have to have relationships that you can go and rely on and resource out and continue to engage properly with to get the understanding. And then of course the communication has to be on point.
And you alluded to, sometimes interacting with people that might be extremely wealthy. Um, Probably, I would imagine, and again, this could be in any franchise model, they're bringing a lot of money back to the corporate space, right? Because they've got great royalties, they have great revenue, so they're a valued partner. But at the same time, maybe they're doing something wrong, committing some type of fraud or doing something kind of outside the boundary. How did you struggle, or did you struggle? How did you overcome those struggles with maybe having to communicate, hey, there's an issue here, so you need to get your corporate partners to realize, yes, this person's a valuable partner, but we need to address an issue. And then have somebody who says, maybe a little egotistical, hey, we're bringing a bunch of money back here. Who are you to tell me we're doing anything wrong? How did you manage some of maybe the egos and persuasion back and forth in those contexts?
Well, a lot of that had to do with relying on partnerships, and, those partnerships, and again, those relationships could be the internal stakeholders, focusing and relying on the operations team who has a day in and day out relationship with that franchise organization, the legal team, which, has a regular, idea of what's going on in those environments, and then of course even the franchisees themselves. Hopefully if you build our goal was to build that positive, proactive, consultative rapport with them, so that they understand that there was a program, there was a team, behind the scenes. We were very open in telling franchisees that we were monitoring sales for royalty assurance, that we were in conversations and we were connected internally to, the supply chain and inventory control and food safety and all that, so that if there was an issue that we would, go out and conduct an investigation. But building that relationship with the franchise organization themselves and trying to express to them this is the value of loss prevention. And it not only does it only involve the restaurants, it involves the organization, the franchise organization itself, that, we would hope that we would have fewer issues. And we did. We saw that, through my tenure there, we did see that the number of issues involving franchisees would drop drastically, because we were seen more as a very supportive, proactive team. Even though we didn't tell them what they needed to do, we were able to communicate to them, what was important to the brand, what was important to their organization. And at the end, ultimately, it'd be a win-win for everybody.
Yeah. Did your did your coffee intake change when you were working for a brand like
When
that?
I left there.
Yeah.
Funny story. I was never a big coffee drinker.
Yeah.
And until of course I took the job at Dunkin. And you were correct. We had free coffee, free donuts, free bagels, and we can't forget about Baskin Robbins brands was part of Dunkin' brands at the time, so we had free ice cream. So they talk about the Dunkin' 20.
Right.
When you start there, I'm an overachiever in everything I try to do, so I was probably the Dunkin' 40
Right.
and gained 40 pounds. So, but still to this day, even though I've left, I'm still an avid Dunkin' fan. I
Yeah.
have my K cups in my local restaurants I visit a couple days a week. Take the dog in the car as I work from home, and we go get him some munchkins, and I grab a coffee for the day.
Loyal supporter. Yeah, well, I appreciate, I mean, working with that brand and you and throughout your career has been really, really neat for us. And I know even from my perspective, like being able to work with different, whether it's law enforcement agencies or corporations, you see all the different unique job tasks that people have, different types of investigations or things they get put into. But again, that kind of common theme throughout is just how do you communicate effectively, right? And so before you got to Duncan, we talked about how part of the reason or the incentive and the value that you brought was your communication ability. You had kind of some interesting pivot points before that, right? So we talked about it from the practitioner side of maybe chasing shoplifters at one point, and then you worked for an investigative firm, really doing investigations and audits at LP Innovations. And you also took on a sales role in a kind of perspective of that job. So maybe walk me through a little bit about what that was like. Like, how do you go from learning how to be a practitioner and actually doing the job, and then trying to sell a product, and then using the product, and it had to be like a kind of a confusing roller coaster from a career development standpoint.
Yeah, well, I'll start right from my early years and then kind of explain right into that. But I started out like everybody else, as I had mentioned, took a store detective role, looking to get into law enforcement. While I was still in school, went from store detective to investigator for a department store, then took a role with a specialty retailer who at the time had 4 brands, about 3,000 stores. Again, this was, we're talking the very beginning of the 90s. So exception-based reporting was very new, right? The tools were coming out, Eastbourne and Aspect and XBR. And the company I was with, we were one of the first ones to use XBR as an exception-based reporting tool. So I was actually, my first pivot was moving away from the field and going into the office to build the exception-based reporting tool because I'm a closet techno geek. I enjoy technology. I always have in my past. And so I started to build that data analytics tool. But then something really strange happened with the growth of XBR and our success with XBR. There was an opportunity, and I give credit to Stephen May, who's a mentor of mine and was my boss at J. Baker, the retailer I'm talking about. He decided we had an opportunity to take the internal loss prevention department at J. Baker and turn it into a profit center. With a couple of opportunities with some retailers who were using XBR but didn't have the expertise and the internal knowledge. So Stephen presented the business plan to the executives at J. Baker, and almost overnight, we went from an internal LP department and a group of practitioners to now a business, a subsidiary, a loss prevention consulting and outsourcing company. And so that was my first real pivot, where overnight, all of us who had worked together as practitioners, were now businessmen and business people. And I remember Stephen, we were sitting there with those of us who were directors and leaders of the internal department. And it was like, okay, you're taking over marketing. You're taking over business development. You're taking over this. You're responsible for sales, for HR. Yeah, and again, at the time, this was the early 90s. From time perspective, internet, email, toddler, if not even infancy stages still from a business perspective. It was cold calling. It was setting up meetings. It was going and, sell. So how do we now, who are practitioners, overnight, okay, I'm responsible for marketing. But, I was responsible for marketing, the training and awareness, the data analytics, and the consulting. We had other folks involved in the field and auditing and all that stuff. So, again, I go back to those three core parts of career building. Where do I learn? How do I learn to communicate and have conversations? And then how do I build relationships? And, this was it. You research an organization, you research a company. Do they have an LP department? Do they not have an LP department? Is there anything that you know about them that, might be related to shrink and loss and the need of one? Who are the key players? Start reaching out to them, building rapport, talk to them about something that might interest them. It was very interesting. And that's where, you get into reading books from Seth Godin and Jeff Blunt and, these other folks that, how do you communicate? Solution selling was new. It was usually widgets and we're selling a service. So it was a very interesting time, but at the core of it, you look back and it's like, okay, what do I know? And I do know interviewing. So how can I take the skills that I've learned on being a good interviewer and shape that skill set into developing business opportunities and developing sales leads? And that's where you have to look at stuff where, to me, every conversation or most conversations, and you could probably say this in your whatever role you're in, personal life or business life, most conversations are either an interview, a sell, or a negotiation, right? Even when I'm having conversations with my wife, and we're trying to figure out something to eat or where do you want to go for dinner?
Right.
It's an interview, it's a negotiation, and then maybe it becomes a sell, right?
Right. Right. Or some resistance and an objection you have to de-escalate all of a sudden the situation.
Yes, that's the fourth piece there. And from in my world, it's just, okay, we just end up going wherever she gives me the name.
Right. I think that's really good feedback though, because, as people just listen kind of to your last segment there and you're talking about like XBR, for example, there's probably some people listening to what the hell is XBR? And what's important is the ability to translate all of these soft skills to any type of role, right? And from an exception-based reporting standpoint, just to help people understand, I remember in the early days of if I wanted to find like a transaction that was fraudulent on a register, or you had to go look for a specific transaction, you had to go to that register physically, hit print, and you'd print the entire day journal on one of those register rolls, and you'd have to go through and look for a specific transaction, which could take hours. And so, exception-based reporting, what it does now which is fascinating, but it's automatically really finding for you these anomalies or issues and what you have to investigate. And what I think the point that you just made that I think is really helpful for people that are listening, whether you're, again, law enforcement, you're in loss prevention, you're in HR, you're in sales or whatever, is figuring out what are you good at. And I like that you said that, is what are you good at and how can you take that kind of skill set and move it into another position. When you did that and you were now this more on the business side of things, so you're reaching out to potential end users and customers and trying to sell a product. Did you find yourself like just the muscle memory of going back to this is an interview, or did you feel like you were trying to learn a whole new sales approach?
Well, to a degree, I think we had to develop our own sales approach. It's almost like even your interview style. You have to create your interview style. You can use all the concepts and the learnings you have on what's needed in an interview, but you still have to kind of adapt it and adopt your own and create your own style. But using those elements and some of those pieces in play there, it's and as I think about it, again, active listening, persuasion, open-ended questions, things like that, and in fact, you just recently had Matt Halloran on,
Right.
with Shut the F Up and Listen. And I read that book and I loved how he easily put these things in play where, even from the sales side, it's like, okay, I need to go and plan my conversation with intent. Right. So what is my goal? What is my intention of the conversation? And at this time it was more difficult because internet wasn't around. I couldn't go and say, all right, if I'm going to go and try to connect with Dave Thompson, let me go on LinkedIn.
Right.
There was no LinkedIn. So, you're trying to look for information however you can, or does somebody know Dave Thompson? Do I know somebody who knows Dave Thompson who might be able to give me some feedback? Right. So what's the plan for the whole conversation you're going to have, and then once you get in front of that individual, you can't lead with the sale. you can't rush the admission or push the interview, right? It's build rapport. What do you have in common that you can have conversation with about that individual? And then, then you can't push the needs or push your services on them. You have to find out what are their challenge points, what are their concerns, so how do you do that? You ask questions. You become an active and engaged listener. You ask open-ended questions. So you can see how all these commonalities and these threads of getting to an interview, instead of an admission, you're really looking to say, okay, can we get a meeting?
Right.
Right. And then once you're in that meeting, are we starting to learn enough information? In fact, I've always looked at it and said very rarely did a sale ever happen right there in the in-person meeting. That's the time to educate them, to listen again to them first, to find out what their needs are. And then there's another piece in there, the in-person meeting I'd always use for my interviewing skills. And I do this even now, today, when I'm ever with a group, is if I'm presenting something and I'm looking for a new initiative or I'm looking to have some buy-in, usually if you have a room of people, you've got the person who's going to say yes, hopefully, right? Or the individual who's going to be the decision maker. And then you've got some stakeholders there, but you may have what I call, champions. And this is, again, something I learned on the sales side that I actually took to the practitioner side, is as you're having conversation and presenting, look at the nonverbal body language of individuals. You may have somebody from another department or someone that might just be in there listening that is actually taking notes or is shaking their head every time that you say something that is very key and important and vital to, a program or initiative. You might be able to then go to that person. Hopefully you already have a relationship or find a way of building a relationship with that person where they can be that internal champion to get to that decision maker. And if you're not looking for those cues, if you're not conversing with the entire room, you're going to miss those opportunities. And I think, again, that's kind of just taking everything that you've learned and about communication and being able to really, be engaged across the entire audience.
Yeah, it seems so simple, but you see it all the time. People are just not maybe socially aware or have the emotional intelligence. But yeah, if you're hosting a meeting or a board meeting or even on a Zoom call, is paying attention to who's paying attention, right? Who's engaged, who's scrolling on their phone. Because you're right, you enter these meetings and you think, here's the key person. Maybe I want to have a meeting with the NRF, and right, and you're the VP of Asset Protection. So I think Dave Johnston is the person I need to really pitch this idea to. But as I'm talking to you, there's somebody else at that boardroom that's taking notes and smiling and interested. And maybe that's the decision maker, or maybe that's the champion that's going to help make the decision afterwards. And so I think that's really good feedback, because I even think just like leading a company meeting, we all have people on our team that might have great ideas that are just hesitant to share them. And so as a leader, maybe you can help extract that information out of somebody by recognizing that.
Yeah. Well, and ask questions to the group, or ask questions to a specific individual, and I do remember times at LP Innovations, when, if the CFO was there, sure, they have the purse strings, but it's going to be the director of operations or the director of stores or somebody else who's really going to be that key point person. So, you have to make sure that your conversation is touching on the entire audience and who's in the room.
Right.
And you have to ask questions so that you can draw out learnings from each one of those individuals. And it should be no different, it's no different internally, or in any role. If you're in law enforcement, you've got multiple witnesses. Sometimes the most quiet witness could be the one that has the most knowledge, and they're just afraid or concerned about, speaking up. Or within your organization, who are the people that are touching on an initiative that you're doing, but may not be a major stakeholder? Do they have information, or even someone who may be similar to your department? I looked, we did a lot, again, on the Dunkin side, we did a lot with the food safety team, food safety and asset protection, loss prevention. So I would always have a great relationship with my peer in food safety, because if I was going to bring an initiative up to leadership, he may have brought in something very similar up. So what did he learn and what does he know? And can he be a champion for me?
Right.
Because he knows the value of security as I do the value of safety.
When you were talking before about not having the ability to research somebody on LinkedIn or kind of leverage digital, you couldn't go on in the early 90s, you couldn't go on TikTok and learn like what's the best sales approach or chat GPT, an email draft that you want to send. And we're going to talk in a minute about the NRF and about NRF Protect, which is coming up in June. And the NRF has given a discount code as well for us to give away for listeners, and we'll do that. We'll do that in just a minute. But I'm wondering this: you're at networking events all the time, right? And NRF Protect is a great place to collaborate and network with other people in the industry. Do you feel like people that kind of maybe grew up reliant on digital networking have a larger gap of communication when it comes to in-person networking? Like, do you feel like maybe you have a leg up, or people that kind of grew up in this pick up the phone and call somebody versus 10 emails? Now I have to go to an event and try to talk to somebody. Have you seen any gap there in people you've worked with at these events?
I do. I think that the gap is, as you would call it, I think it's not so much meeting people, it's building those solid, engaged relationships. And look, I've got two 20-something-year-olds now, a son and a daughter, and I know the challenges of communicating with them. And I think that sometimes they're not as engaged. They don't get as deep in relationships, as we used to and we had to. So I think that's the important piece of it. And any younger professionals out there, I would look at trying to build deep, strong relationships. For example, I know you and I know the first time we met. I remember the first time we met. I think it was probably almost 10 or 11 years ago, in fact,
Yeah.
because when you first start, right before you started with WZ. I knew we were in Nashville. We were at an IAI event. And I recall you and I, the only time we agreed on something from a sports perspective was we were giving another individual a hard time because the New York Rangers were in the playoffs.
Right.
And neither of our teams were, right? Can you have those and I can rattle off several of those with several folks because the ability to build the relationships, to stay in the key contacts. Now, I say that you and I know that, but you and I, we don't have a very personal relationship. We see each other at industry events. We saw each other at the LPRC this past week, and when we catch up. But we can't do that through a mobile device, or we can't do that while we're checking our emails or our different types of social media accounts. You have to do that by engaging with individuals and having conversations and spending time with them.
Yeah.
Again, I'll reference back to Matt Halloran's podcast with you with the different types. I hate to be a parachuter,
Right.
which is the person that just flies in. Hey, how you doing? Good, everything's fine, and we just pass by each other. Unfortunately, there are times where I have to do that. If you catch me at a Protect conference, I've probably got 5 or 6 places I need to be, and I apologize for that. But I try to reconnect with individuals to get a little bit deeper. Let me come back and have those conversations. And those are important conversations, and those are important relationships. And it doesn't matter if it's an industry partner, if it's a retailer. You want to build those relationships in the industry.
Yeah.
And you have to be engaged. You have to be active. You have to be someone, to go out there. And you could be an introvert, if you want. I had one of my leaders in a former role who was very introverted, but he learned how to become an active and engaged listener and a great communicator, a great presenter. But his tendencies would be an introvert. And that was great because I'm an extrovert. So we were yin and yang, and it worked perfectly. And that's another piece too. If you've got partnerships in your organization, can you play off of each other to be able to be even stronger together?
Yeah. And I think when you're talking about the relationships, genuine, right, and sincere relationships, because a lot of times people have these quick touch points and it feels like it's just not, they're just asking the question to pretend that they care, and they're moving on. And I will say, because I remember that conference where we met, and there was you and some other folks in the industry, that if you weren't genuine, right, and you're somebody, and I tell people, they connect with you on LinkedIn, definitely. You're all and approach you at an industry event, because even if Dave Johnston's the VP of Asset Protection at NRF, which is a huge, huge role. You're never too big to help mentor or collaborate with somebody. And that helped me. I wouldn't be in the position I'm in if I didn't have somebody like you at that event that didn't mind connecting to somebody at the time. I didn't have any really importance or value maybe to you, but that didn't matter. It was about the relationship, and I think that was really impactful. So I think that's important lesson for people to have. And what's kind of neat is it brings us to where you're at today. You've taken all of these different verticals in your life and experience, and now working for the National Retail Federation. You have such an important role. And the NRF does so many different things. And so I'll let you explain that first for people that maybe don't know. They've heard NRF a million times or they never have. What is the NRF, and what is really your kind of key role there?
Yeah, well, the NRF is the National Retail Federation, and it is the largest retail trade association, of course, in the U.S., and we even have tentacles globally in supporting other trade associations on the retail side. And really, what it's advocacy, engagement, and involvement. So our role is to be the voice of the retail industry. So whatever is important to the retailers, whether it be through legislation or whether it be through regulation or even education and engagement, that is what we stand for. So my role, and I am one of several, call us subject matter experts who work across different disciplines. I oversee the asset protection and the retail operations side. So what I do is I work with all the other departments within NRF. So public relations, communications, government relations, membership, conferences, and content. And what can I do to have membership engagement, to have support, and to be the subject matter expert in whatever they need from us. My focus is our membership. So even though, and this is where it's kind of changed a little bit, where I talk a lot about being the listener and the learner and all that stuff. My role now is I have to be the voice. I have to be the communicator. But even though I am out there in the media, I am front and center on stage at our conferences. My success is based on, again, going back to, the learning, the communicating, and the building relationships, because my success is because of the success of our members. My voice has to carry their stories, has to carry their concerns. And the only way I can do that is by having the relationships, to communicating and to learning from them. And it goes back to everything I've talked about: building rapport, asking open-ended questions, having genuine conversations with everyone, and it goes for industry partners as well as for the retailers. And even in this role, how can we help out state retail associations? How can we help out law enforcement? How can we help out prosecutors? What do we need to do to get two-way communication from legislators? So it's, I would definitely say I'm taking a big breath here because, yeah, that's, this role here, I took this because as I looked at this opportunity, it was the people, the purpose, and the passion. It was the people who I'd be representing, the passion for the industry and the profession that I've grown up with throughout my decades, and it's the purpose that we have as and I'm not even just saying loss prevention, asset protection. We'll extend that to law enforcement and first responders. It's keeping communities safe and secure. It's keeping the retail industry safe and secure. It's keeping our national economy safe and secure. And it's been a great role. I've taken everything that I've learned and the communication style of every role that I've had, and have just now kind of, been a great 2.5 years, and I'm looking forward to more and achieving more on behalf of the industry. Yeah, it's been great.
It's so cool. I mean, there's so much that I don't think people realize. It moves so fast, right? What the trending topics are. But I know in the last couple of years, and you could probably expand on this, but you mentioned media and you mentioned legislative, right? And those are really two areas of communication we haven't touched on yet, that all of a sudden the camera's on you and you maybe are communicating a little more selectively than you would have in a one-to-one meeting. Or I know you've done a great job with your partners of organizing some legislative discussions and stakeholder conversations in DC, which can be extremely intimidating and can be a difficult thing for people to communicate effectively when they're being questioned by members of Congress. And if I just back up for a second, some of the topics I know that the NRF and you have worked on, everything from organized retail crime, which is trying to change the perception of, what is shoplifting versus what is organized retail, data privacy concerns, or making sure that investigators have the ability to capture information they need to protect the consumer and protect the employees. And then, you mentioned safety, making sure that people that work in the retail space feel safe going to work and people feel safe going into stores. And there's been so many issues with, just workplace violence and active shooters and those types of things. There's just so much that happens in our community that retail impacts that I don't think people realize. And so I'm sure there's more priorities that you're all working on, but I'm curious about those kind of high stakes topics. How have you learned how to communicate that when all of a sudden you've got ABC, CNN, and NPR, whoever wants to interview you on these topics? How do you prepare for those conversations?
Yeah. Well, first I'm going to say I have the benefit of retail members who help us with understanding their opportunities, their successes, sharing their stories. Again, I'm the voice. Behind me is a fantastic team of retailers, our government relations folks who are out there every day, talking to legislators, our PR and communications team who's always out there. So, no person is an island and no person is above anyone else. And it's a huge team effort at the NRF. And with all trade associations, the work that we do. But again, it goes back to the core elements of preparing or having communication, right? It's, when I do media, or if I'm going to go in with our GR team and meet with legislators, what do I know about those individuals? What stories have they written? What committees are they part of? What are some of the things that are near and dear to them from a legislative standpoint? What's the intent? What do we want to come across with? We don't try to be selective, but you do know that, there's a point that we want to be told or that we want to tell. And we want to make sure that we express that in a way that is relatable because even if you're doing media, the goal is not to communicate to the media spokesperson for them, because the story is going to go to the public. So, when we talk ORC, for example, ORC is not a victimless crime. We have to make sure that we express that it's not only even about the violence. Although the violence is priority, it's not solely about the violence that's happening against employees or that customers may see, but it's the impact to the communities. There's a financial impact, yes, when you say sales tax revenue and all that, but there's also a social impact where if the communities, if a store has to close, how does that impact the community? If a store has to reduce its hours or reduce its workforce because of theft, how does that impact the community? If there's a hit in sales, the communities don't get revenue from the sales. How does that impact health and human services and other things like law enforcement and so forth? So again, it's building those communication styles to get to the core of the issue, but really get to the root concern of or the impact of what we're doing, and that's with legislators or the media. Next week we have Hill visits, so we're going to have loss prevention leaders from a number of companies go to Capitol Hill and have conversations with legislators about the issue of ORC. Their stories are very impactful. Again, they're the heroes in this whole thing. They're the ones that are seeing this day in and day out. They're the ones that are hearing the stories and seeing the impact to their employees. So, bringing that story to the legislators is extremely important in our overall efforts. And
That part I want to just expand on for people because a lot of times, people see the testimony, right? They might see a quick little clip on Facebook or Twitter X or whatever, or TikTok of here's the question that a congressperson asked. Here's the witness's response. They got cut off, and it's this little back and forth kind of witty banter. Um, but a majority of that conversation happens not that day, right? A lot of this conversation about maybe a proposed legislation or whatever, an amendment to something, are all these conversations beforehand. So maybe just high level, what does that look like that people aren't seeing? Like, what's kind of the preparation and practice and strategy look like when you're actually trying to help communicate to legislators the true importance of some type of proposed bill?
Well, again, I go back to our GR team and thank them because they do that day in and day out. They're constantly getting in front of lawmakers and the legislative offices and working with those teams and feeding them information. You mentioned the committee, the conversation. That's a separate thing, and I'll get back to that. But yes, I was very nervous.
Right.
When I had to testify in front of one of the subcommittees, I think it was December of 23. But when you're sitting there in a legislator's office and you're talking to either them or their legislative director, because many times you may not be speaking to the congressperson or the senator themselves. You're speaking to someone in their office. They listen. They're engaged, and it's a conversation. It's an opportunity to educate them on the real concerns. It's an opportunity to educate them on the issue, of course. But for the most part, they ask questions. They want to know exactly, how does it impact the individual and the people. So they take it to heart. And this is where we know we fell short on the Corker bill in the last congressional session, as many bills do. Probably more, I don't know the number, but more bills probably die, of course, than become law. But one of the things we were very successful in is we had over 160 co-sponsors in both the House and the Senate for that bill, and they were sister bills in each of the in the House and the Senate. And of that 160 plus co-sponsors, it was bipartisan. So we know that this issue touches people. It does. It's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. It's a people issue. And I think that coming into this new session, we're currently working with Senator Grassley, who was the sponsor of the last Corker bill. We're working with his office. We're working with others to reintroduce the Corker bill in this session. And we know that what we've done already has built a good foundation for what's going to hopefully be a successful bill in this congressional session. And it takes everybody. And the retailers, our GR team, other trade associations, to really try to continue to build the momentum of why we need federal support.
I wish I've had, on a state level, I've had some of that experience where you just mentioned like how engaged and productive conversations are in the office with legislator or their staff. And then it feels like a completely different animal when the cameras are on. And you mentioned this before with media, which I thought was an interesting point of like, who's the message for? And when you're being interviewed by, a media and you got a reporter and a camera, you're thinking about this is going out to the public. So that's where the message is for. And I just wonder how much that impacts these committee hearings where when you're in a closed room in an office and you can have genuine conversation because that's your audience, all of a sudden people are on camera. And now the question they're asking you isn't necessarily for you. It's because they want their constituents to hear the question or they want it to go viral or whatever it might be. But you referenced this earlier, so I'm just curious what that experience, because the nerves and the preparation, no matter how much of an expert you are, having to sit there knowing it's going to be live streamed and you've got some important people asking you questions. What did that feel like?
Yeah, as I said, I was nervous going into it. I was prepared, but nervous nonetheless. And I think that is a unique environment because as you watch and I'm constantly watching Fox News, C-SPAN, CNN. I've got multiple TVs
Right.
in my office, and you listen to some of the Senate or the House testimonies that you hear, and someone like the FBI director or someone else that they're battering them with questions, and you're like, wow, is that going to be me? Now, fortunately for us, I was there was with a very experienced and panel of individuals testifying. Again, it was a topic that I think everyone knew was a concern and a challenge, but we did have some of those conversations where questions were asked that the the intent or their intention of asking that question was not to get may have not have been to get a response from me or to get a response that I can't respond
Right.
because but that was one of those times where I was also, in preparation is know when to speak, know what to say, and know when to shut up,
Yeah.
and just use that silence. Don't try to answer a question if you don't know the answer to it. And there was a time I look back there, and there was a time where I didn't have the all the answers. I had some of the answers, but as I rattled off the answer, they kind of spun it to a political spin. And I'm like, well, okay, if I had said this city and this state instead of those, then, what would happen? But, that's the great thing about this. You listen, you learn.
Oh yeah.
Your communication can always get better. I'm not an expert in any way of any form. But it was, it was a good opportunity to learn, and experience, something that I never thought I would be doing in my career. I never thought that even catching shoplifters in the late 80s, I never would have thought of testifying in front of Congress.
Right. Well, I
Um,
will say though, I watched it. You did a great job. The panel, you're right. You had a really, really good panel, and it is interesting without getting in the weeds with the questions, but there's questions that are asked that clearly were intended to put no matter what answer you were going to give, right? The follow-up was going to be trying to categorize, well, those are either Democratic or Republican cities, and whichever way they're trying to persuade people whether it was a good or a bad thing. And what I think what the point you just made is a good one for people to kind of to leave with, is knowing what is your role in that conversation. And even sometimes when you're in kind of a negative or a potential escalating conversation, it's better not to try to prove your point there, because it might just be an uphill argument. And especially if you think about those committee hearings, even the way the room is set up, right? You're at a panel at a table and the committee's higher up, right? And they control when the mics are on and off. They control who gets to speak. And when you control the microphone, you control the narrative. And so just kind of being aware of what your role is. And you all did a great job. But I think that's just such a neat experience for people to have. And anyway, so I think it's important people know what NRF is doing, the huge impact that you all have. I know coming up in a few months, we've got NRF Protect. And so maybe you can just give high level, what is that looking like this year, and what's the reason to be there? We've been there for well beyond the time I've been at WZ, well over 2 decades. WZ is always a part of the NRF and appreciate all the education and networking and collaboration that happens. But what can we look forward to this year?
yeah, well, first of all, thank you. WZ is a great partner and supporter of NRF, not only the conference, but also NRF overall. As you mentioned, NRF Protect is going to be June 23rd to the 25th. It's at the Gaylord Texan in Grapevine, Texas, right outside of Dallas. We've got a lot of new programs, including a WZ educational workshop that starts us off on Monday. That's open to any retailer. If you have an all access pass, you get it for free. If you're an expo only, you get it for a nominal fee. And I believe that's going to be something that you may not get you may not get all of it at either an IAI or one of your learning workshops and your certification courses. So you want to learn something new, get to that WZ workshop. Beyond that, we've also started listening to a lot of our feedback that's coming every year from our Protect. And this year we're doing something new where we have 3 collaborative conversations. So they are going to be 3 90-minute peer-to-peer engagement opportunities. And we're curating, it's a moderated roundtable where we're curating some conversations that are specific to field-based LPAP personnel, data analytics. So those folks that are involved in the data and the computer science of it, as well as digital and e-commerce fraud. So we want to give people opportunities to get together and to communicate and to learn from each other. So those are our 3 new programs we have. But beyond that, everything else, we have an expo hall of over a couple hundred exhibitors. We have our Fusion Center, which has over 25 law enforcement agencies, departments, ORCAs, and so forth, and then over 30 learning sessions on topics that we're all dealing with today, issues of today. So hopefully we see everyone there, and I know that we have provided a special code for our listeners and to get some money off an all access pass.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Well, we're going to drop a link to registration in the show notes. So if you're driving, hopefully don't do that right now, but we'll put it there. You can go back to whether you're listening on Apple, Spotify, Podbean, wherever, we'll put a link in the show notes. We'll also put the coupon code there. NRF was gracious enough to give a $200 off code. So I'll give you all that in a second as we wrap up, but excited to be at Protect. Always a great event. And honestly, you kicked this off with kind of these 3 pillars of what you've found successful in your career growth. All those things happen at your conference, right? As you're building these relationships, you're committed to continued education, and you're focused on how do you effectively communicate. So all 3 really are happening there. So I look forward to being a part of it. Before we wrap up and kind of close off our show, I think I gave you a heads up, but I don't remember, but we let every guest just have the opportunity. If there's one last thing that, people were kind of listening, now's the time to re-listen and focus, and one last truth or one last takeaway. And then if there's any other way that you recommend people connect with you or with the NRF.
Yeah, I think I'd leave everyone with, I know we talked a lot about those, what I call my 3 tenets but the one truth, the one thing to focus on is focus on helping others achieve success. And by doing that, you'll have a great opportunity to build relationships, talk to many people, learn many new things. And then most of all, I think you'll see that your success grows organically. And so, believe in servant leadership, focus on others, help them achieve success, and you'll see yourself grow and achieve success here on your own.
That's a great takeaway. And I can say a testament, proof of concept to that is what you did for me well over a decade ago. So I appreciate that. And thanks for spending time with us today. Before everybody hops off, make sure to stay on for a few more seconds and I'll give you that coupon code. But I'm going to let Mr. Johnston get back to his busy day. So thanks for joining us. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. The NRF and Wick Lanners-Zalowski are proud to offer those retailers listening to this podcast a $200 discount on a retailer all-access retail pass to NRF Protect 2025. The event's going to be held June 23rd to 25th at the Gaylord Texan in Grapevine, Texas. Enter code WZ200, that's capital WZ200, in the promotional code box when registering. Make sure to also register for the WZ Education Workshop on Monday, June 23rd at 1 to 3 p.m., which is included in this all-access retailer pass. Instructions on how to register and use the code are listed in the show notes. We hope to see you there. To help more listeners find our show, please provide us a rating, give us a follow, and share this episode with your colleagues. For the latest news and to engage with our guests, follow Truth Be Told on your favorite social media apps. And don't forget, we are available on all major platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and watch a video of this episode on YouTube. On behalf of our guests and valued sponsors, thanks again for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told.